Okay, AP Econ classes, I have not formally given this lesson in a few years because the Keynesian Cross, as it's called, is no longer on the AP test, but I do think it's important to learn, and we're going to do some activities later in the week using it. So it is more formally known as the aggregate expenditure model, informally called the Keynesian Cross. I did think this was a helpful quote. It's from an article by Paul Krugman, where in the article they state, "Failure to represent reality accurately is rarely a fatal flaw in economics. In an economics model, what's valued is the model's usefulness as an analytical tool or an analytic tool." The point in showing you this is you're going to see some weaknesses in the Keynesian Cross. He's not worried about inflation. There's nothing about the price level. For many of you, that would be a concern about trying to spend your way out of a recession, but he's focused on the short term, and the analytical nature of the model has its limitations. Having flaws is not a problem for economists. So here's a basic breakdown if you look at the classical as opposed to the Keynesian, and if you've looked at the ASAD lecture, that's what we're going to refer to as the classical school, where you'd say full employment is normal. In other words, there's that vertical long-run aggregate supply. Say's law states that supply creates its own demand. You put the emphasis on production, and then consumption will follow. Everything is fully flexible. And the role of government should be laissez-faire, not to get involved. Savings will have no real effect in terms of causing a recession to be prolonged, which you're going to see as a contentious point. They'll just say the real interest rate will regulate the amount of money to be borrowed. The Keynesian model over here, he was worried that the economy is inherently unstable. There's going to be large swings in the business cycle. What is going to determine GDP is consumption rather than production. That aggregate expenditures will increase when consumers buy more. And it doesn't really matter who's doing the consuming. You can imagine the government now stepping in. He was also worried that prices were not downwardly flexible. That's another way of saying that they're sticky. The people may not take wage cuts to go back to work, and therefore the government must intervene. Savings, this is called the paradox of thrift. For him, this was a leakage. Now, again, for the classical school, savings is great for the long run. The irony here is that it can be bad in the short run on the Keynesian model. So this is just a quick review. Remember the Keynesian aspect of the graph. Aggregate demand is here, right? And aggregate demand could increase. Now you have a little bit of demand pull inflation in the intermediate phase, or the short run aggregate supply we'll use, and then the classical phase, everything is flexible up here, and increases in aggregate demand do not increase output. Here I have Reed Say's law handout on supply and demand theory. That is in your packet. I would like you to read it. It'll only take a couple minutes. So the key idea, we'll do this rather quickly. The amount of goods and services produced depends directly on the level of total spending, right? Aggregate expenditures. That's the key idea. So this is the end. This is what the Keynesian Cross is going to look like after a few more minutes of lecture here. You can see we're adding up consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports. This 45-degree line here is crucial. Do you notice that? The 45-degree line is essentially saying here on the y-axis you have aggregate expenditures, and down here you have real GDP. And clearly this is showing a one-to-one relationship. So at this point you would say all that's being produced, GDP, is being consumed, right? Any point on the 45-degree line, it's a one-to-one relationship. All that's being produced is being consumed. But as you can see, the slope of this line is different. And as we're going to learn in class, that's going to be determined by the marginal propensity to consume, which is defined as the amount of each dollar you'd spend on consumption rather than savings or taxes. But for simplicity, we're going to say every dollar you either get to spend or save, and each extra dollar is your marginal propensity to consume. So looking down here at the bottom, planned aggregate expenditure is CI, G, and X. The 45-degree line, all points where production equals expenditures, and equilibrium occurs where aggregate expenditures equal production. So consumption, as you've learned before, it's the largest and most stable component of GDP. We don't have taxes here. Disposable income equals consumption plus saving. Well, disposable meaning after taxes, so it's consumption plus saving. consumption and savings are related to the income level, and DI stands for disposable income. So you'd say as disposable increases, families consume a smaller portion and save a larger portion. And this is a strong relationship. Clearly, the more money you have, the more you can consume. But the more money you have, savings go up. And this isn't controversial. Poor people don't have any money to save, but the more you earn, the more you can save. So this is a key point for Keynes. If you look at this graph, and this, here we just put consumption and disposable income, you're thinking in the long term, we're going to call this aggregate expenditures and GDP. The idea is this consumption line is saying that right here, you're at equilibrium. But at any disposable income, let's use a different color, to the left of this, your spending on consumption, say right here, exceeds your disposable income. And you can see that's called savings. It's all this area in there. Right? And anything to the right, maybe we should use a different color. Try yellow. Anything to the right, now your savings, this difference, right, between what you consume and what you produce, this savings is now considered by Keynes a leakage on the economy. So here, your income equals your consumption. To the right of that, your savings exceed your consumption. So your disposable income is higher than what you spend. So the paradox of thrift stated more fully, if savings are not immediately transferred into investment, and hence into expenditures, demand will fall below production and there will be excess supply. Now, how does savings turn into investment? Right? All of your savings, we've talked about this here, investment in plant and capital makes the whole economy grow. And I'm going to show you, I'm going to prove just with some equations in class that all of your savings goes into banks and eventually turns into investment spending. Keynes was worried that might not be very fast and that the money is a leakage and it could sit in banks. The classical school was not worried about that. They would say all money spent or saved is going to be received by somebody eventually, and investment would happen in the economy. But again, we'll do some of that proof in class. So here's from your book. You can see equilibrium is at 390. Anything to the right of that, say at 410, you can see that there's savings of $5 billion. And it's where the savings schedule here shows that as incomes increase, so do your savings. So anything to the right here, this is all savings. And to the left, savings down there in yellow. Investment, and this is key. You need to know this graph that we're about to do, the investment graph. And again, investment in economics. This is not paper. This is spending on plant, capital, and equipment. Keynes thought this was the most volatile and unpredictable aspect of the economy. And the reason is that depreciation occurs for businesses where they have to replace things. They set aside money every year to do this, but they may not have a regular replacement schedule. Irregular innovation means suddenly the internet comes about and everybody has to make capital upgrades to be internet compatible. Or your profits just fluctuate as a business. So the basic idea, though, is businesses are going to invest if the expected rate of return is higher than the real interest rate, and investments will continue until returns equal the interest rate. So here's a demand curve. As you would expect, I could say at really high rates of interest, will companies want to spend on investment? And the answer is no. At 16%, they would not want to spend any money on investment. Down at 0%, they would want to spend $40 billion on investment. So there's an inverse relationship, as you'd expect. So say at 12%, $10 billion could be invested profitably because they would expect to make at least that on a return. But again, if the interest rate drops down to 4%, that triples the amount of investment dollars because businesses have a lot more projects that are profitable if they only have to pay 4% on the money they borrow. So the next assumption we will make here is, let's say, ceteris paribus. I'm going to abbreviate that. At a rate of 8%, $20 billion are going to be invested. So you'd say $20 billion is I. over here. That's the investment schedule based on the interest rate. And we're going to stack that right on consumption. So notice what we did. Here now is C plus I, stacked right on top of consumption. And what you're going to see in a minute here is that's our new equilibrium. And notice what investment equals. Savings. That's an N. You remember before when we said this distance, anything to the right of consumption here, all this is savings? Well, at equilibrium, savings equals planned investment. So you can see here, investment is 20 billion. At equilibrium, savings are 20 billion. Here was just consumption, equilibrium. Here's the new consumption, or consumption and investment equilibrium. And again, equilibrium can be defined as savings equals planned investment. And what happens to the right of 470? Say up at 510. Can you see up here? I know it's difficult to write well on this, but up at this point, 510 for production, and it looks like only 510 billion for production, and 500 roughly for consumption and investment. So that extra 10 billion is now savings beyond planned investment. Inventories are going to start to swell, and we're going to enter a recession. So that's what this slide essentially says. Here's at equilibrium in yellow. Consumption plus investment at equilibrium, you can see planned investment equals savings. To the left of it, in blue, your total spending on C and I exceeds production, and so you have dis-savings. You're drawing down all your inventories. To the right, here in pink, our total spending is less than GDP. We're producing more than is being spent. This area, again, is going to be saving in excess of spending, and we're going to start to enter a recession as inventories develop and consumers aren't buying stuff. So this is important. It's always true that savings equals actual investment. The key question is, does it equal planned investment? We're going to pick up the pace here. Oh, Josiah. It's a pretty awesome picture of my son. All right. Key points. This is a summary slide. Keynesian equilibrium, aggregate output equals desired expenditures, or planned investment equals savings. Savings is what he would call a leakage, and investment is an injection. If inventories are developing, savings exceed planned investment, and unplanned investment is taking place, so production is going to be reduced. If you're having shortages, savings are less than investment, inventories are drawn down, disinvestment, more resources are employed, and production will increase. So before we just had C and I, now let's add the rest of the world, right? Positive net exports, meaning we export more than we import, are going to increase aggregate expenditures. If we import more than we export, that will decrease aggregate expenditures. So, in Keynesian language, imports are a leakage, exports are an injection. Just like savings, we're going to say ceteris paribus, they're independent of GDP. So we just stack it on Tom. Tom's my dad's name. On top, you can see at equilibrium. Let's start here at this point, 470. If you have positive net exports, you'd shift up. If you had negative net exports, you would shift down to here. Just stack it on top. And we need to add the government, G. Okay? If government spending goes up, aggregate expenditures will go up. If taxes go up, aggregate expenditures will go down because consumption would go down, right? So in Keynesian language, taxes are a leakage and government spending is an injection. Again, this is autonomous, and you can see the invention here of deficit spending. Because if this is true, what Keynes is saying is to get out of a recession, have a whole bunch of G and lower T, right? You don't want this, and that's going to shift AE up. Now notice there's nothing about inflation. It's a weakness in the model. And you can see here, government spending of $20 billion. And you shift up to this curve. Try and highlight that. That wasn't very good. So slightly better. Now, one thing, if you've done the reading in the book, one thing that is beautiful about this model is that you can see the multiplier really well. Look at what the $20 billion in spending did to GDP. GDP increased from 470 to 550. So how could 20 in spending turn into 80 in output? That's called the multiplier. And what it means here, as you can see, is the multiplier had to be 4, meaning every $1 spent by the government turned into 4 total dollars of spending in the economy, and this is going to come back to marginal propensity to consume. And it means that marginal propensity to consume was 0.75. If you've done the reading, the multiplier is 1 over the marginal propensity to save. If it was 1 over 0.25, it's got to be 4. And if you're spending, if you're saving 25 cents on the dollar, you're spending 3/4 of it. So MPC had to be 0.75. We'll do more of that in class. But this is the brilliant part of Keynes's model is you can see the multiplier. On ASAD, you can't see the multiplier. So even though he doesn't account for inflation, he does show the multiplying effect really well. And we'll actually do a skit about this in class. So final points. There's a lot to take in. At equilibrium, leakages equal injections. And all of the leakages for Keynes, savings, imports, and taxes, then are equal to investment spending, exports, and government spending, because those are injections. You essentially have the same determinants throughout in terms of shifting, as you could see. And as I've mentioned throughout this lecture, the limitations of the model. Nothing about inflation. You can't even show full employment output. You have to just say it's 500 billion. It's right there. But you'd have no way to see it. You have the vertical LRAS on the other graph, and you can't show cost-push inflation. And we'll talk about how Milton Friedman saw this as a serious problem and predicted the end of the Keynesian Cross. So that's it. Enjoy.